Hi, this is Chris Rudolph, and I'm sitting here with Goldie Sherman, talking to her about her time in San Miguel. Can you tell us how you got here? When did you first arrive?
I first arrived in San Miguel in 1967, and I was 15 years old. It was the first time that I took a plane by myself. I felt very grown up. I feel like now when I look back, I had my quinceañera here, although I didn't have a formal party like that at all. But I came when I was 15. Reva and Leonard Brooks, my aunt and uncle, had been living in San Miguel since 1947. And because they didn't have children, my sister and I were the closest relatives to them. And my sister, who is 2.5 years older than I, she came when she was 15. So then it was my turn to come. And I arrived here, and Reva and Leonard met me at the airport and whisked me off to the Roma district of Mexico City.
Okay, Mexico City, yes.
Into a very interesting home of some friends of theirs. I think their last name was the Benjamins, and I was introduced to a bohemian, artsy, creative life. And you can imagine a 15-year-old from Toronto, Canada, just being exposed to some experience of art, culture, music, and very eccentric. And I guess there was something that in me that really resonated with that, and I fell in love pretty much the first day that I was here. Leonard was born in Britain and came to Canada during the wartime because it was safer here. Reva was born in Toronto from immigrant parents, Polish background. And they lived in Toronto. They met in Toronto when they were younger. They married in Toronto, and Reva and Leonard wanted to have 5 children. Unfortunately, my aunt had ectopic pregnancies, so she could not have any children at all. She was depressed in Toronto. My uncle was working as an art teacher at Northern Secondary School in Toronto. And so they had heard through a friend that there was this place called San Miguel de Allende, and that there was a GI Bill through the US government, and that the Canadian government, Veterans Affairs, also gave a stipend for artists who would like to be learning some new art techniques or getting accreditation. So my uncle thought, well, they weren't doing well in Toronto. My uncle didn't want to be a teacher, he wanted to be an artist. And they said, let's take a chance and let's go for a year. So the Canadian, because my uncle also was a war artist, he had gone on ships and painted many paintings as...
Actually, he was a very well-known war
very
artist.
well-known war artist. His work is in the War Art Museum in Ottawa. So at any rate, they gave them a stipend for a year. They came to San Miguel. And really, that was it. They fell in love with San Miguel. And Leonard, who came as a student originally, when he met Sterling Dickinson and went to the art school thinking he was going to learn mural making and lithography, Sterling had said to him, I think we need good teachers, and you are more teacher material than a student, so would you please come on faculty? So one thing led to another. They fell in love with San Miguel. They had work here, and they stayed for the rest of their lives.
So when you're 15 years old and you arrive here, what did you see? Like coming into town, most of us have been here for a while. Talk about that moment on the bus usually when you turned the corner and came down the Caracol. What did you see?
Well, I recall, you know what, I do have a diary of that year, of those 3 months that I was here. It was during the summertime. So I recently read it because I thought, who was I then and what was I thinking? I remember there was a couple of things, it was very mysterious to me because it was so different. I remember that we saw a terrible accident on the highway, and that for the first time I saw some dead bodies on the highway, and that was a little bit of a shock to my system. I remember sticking my head out the window of the bus and smelling the air of this high desert. And honestly, I've understood more about synesthesia now than I I mean, then I didn't know it. But synesthesia is when some of your senses are crisscrossed. And when I remember sticking my head out of the window of that bus and smelling this air and having a visceral feeling in my body about, it was almost like I was remembering something. It was almost like a deep memory of something, and I just felt, it's even hard to put into words, a deep emotion and connection to this area or the climate or the mountains. I mean, I was born in Canada. I was born in Toronto. There's no mountains in Toronto. And then coming into town, and it was a very small town then. Nothing existed past the Instituto. It was pure dust. So it was very tiny, and I just felt charmed. I felt like, I think I've always been like as a child, nature was always very important to me. So I felt like I was surrounded by a different kind of nature, but something that I really felt connected to in some mysterious way. And it could have been because Reva and Leonard would come to Toronto frequently, and they brought us all kinds of Mexican toys and Mexican cloth. And so as I was growing up, Mexico and the culture and the artisania of Mexico was always in my life. So maybe, I don't really understand how that all happened, but that was part of it. It was almost like it was familiar to me. So Reva was my mother's sister. So Reva was very protective of me, and she hovered a lot. But she introduced me to the Bellas Artes, and she said, there's a lot of art classes that you can take here. She took me over to the Instituto. She said, look at all the art classes here. So what she did, she said, whatever you want to do. It is our pleasure to let you take whatever classes and courses that you'd like to do. It's up to you. And she did say to me, she kept saying, and we're going to step back, and really have your own experience. But she really didn't step back. She hovered most of the time. And when she finally did, about 3 weeks before I left, I thought, what's wrong with my auntie? She's leaving me alone, Because, again, she really wanted me to have the best time, but Reva was quite controlling in her own way. But I took a lot of courses. I took courses at the Bellas Artes. I took courses weaving, ceramics, theater, drawing. I was in my element. I just had the most transformative summer of my life. There was lots of students, international students there, and the courses I felt were wonderful. I remember Leona Boyd. I don't know if you ever heard of Leona Boyd. She's a Canadian guitarist, very well known now. And she was practicing at the Bellas Artes. Like, it was very romantic. You could hear this beautiful guitar playing while you were while I was weaving in the weaving studio. I was learning Spanish at the time, but all my teachers were really, I took classes where my teachers were Mexican and Spanish speaking. So I was really immersed totally. It was an immersion in the culture. And my aunt, we would have comida de sábado, the Saturday comida. I remember the bolillos, like things that were very, things tasted different then. The life was so different then.
So who would be people they would have around their table?
They had tons of musicians and artists. Every day there would probably be visitors, international people. My aunt was a very good manager of Leonard's career. So anybody who came from Canada or the U.S. or also a national in Mexico, they would always arrive at Reva and Leonard's house because she knew that this was a very good way of promoting Leonard, and that was really part of her job.
But let's talk about Reva separately, because she's actually a quite well-known photographer.
She has been recognized as one of the 40 most accomplished women photographers in the world. Iconically, she only practiced her photography for 3 years. She left her gift behind when she decided to take care of Leonard and his career. I think that was the time when women did that more, so I can understand how she did that. But her photos are in MoMA, in New York, the Family of Man. She was the only one in town. This is so you can imagine, well, 1947, 48. Reva was the only one in town who had a camera. And she had a rollie that would sit at her heart center. And one day, I think it was even Sterling Dickinson's housekeeper or some relative of his housekeeper knocked on Reva's door, and unfortunately her child had died. And I think he was about 3 years old. So she asked Reva to take pictures of him. As you know, they put the child out with a crown on his head and they lay them out in the church. And initially Reva did not want to do that. She felt really afraid. She had never done anything like that before. But she came around to thinking, yes, this woman has really, you know, she could have the compassion for this woman, especially because Reva could not have children herself, and then the tragedy of losing a child. So she went, and I remember Reva would say she was swatting flies away from the child in order to get a picture that she felt was honoring the child. And she also took a very beautiful portrait of Elodia, the mother. And these are and the funeral. So these are the pictures that are actually in the Family of Man, and that she's been praised for, you know, and has recognition for. So, and I think for those 3 years, she was very interested in women and children. So that was her focus, and it makes sense, because her greatest sorrow, and which continued through her whole life, because I've read her diaries, and she over and over and over again, it's like, I just so am depressed that I could not have children for Leonard. I so lament that I could never have those children that I really wanted and that Leonard wanted. So it also, you know, I mean, it's all in this beautiful book, Artists in Exile, that John Virtue wrote. Their whole story is here. I think it's a very realistic view. Leonard gave John Virtue full permission to, you know, expose everything, the good and the bad and the ugly.
Did they not think about maybe adopting children here?
I think in their own way, they adopted many children. There's a beautiful story about the Hermanos Aguascalientes that are very famous musicians here in San Miguel. They live on Calle de los Muertos, and they're about my age. And when they were little boys, their father, who was a mariachi player, knocked on the door of Reva and Leonard. Leonard was the only one who taught violin, and their father asked Leonard if he would teach his boys the violin. And Leonard said, okay, bring them over on Saturday afternoon and we'll see what we can do. So the two little boys, the Hermanos Aguascalientes, came over. And Reva photographed. So in Reva's photography book, I'm sorry I don't have one here, but it's just beautiful. We have a beautiful collection of her photographs in a book. The boys came over. Reva saw that, they needed a little cleanup. So she put them in in this big bin, this big metal bin to wash them up. She fed them, and then she brought them to Leonard, and they had, Leonard really donated his time and effort to teaching the Hermanos Aguascalientes from little wee boys, and as they grew, well, they're very famous now in Mexico. Yeah. And when there's a special presentation or exhibition, they come to honor Leonard and play. And we had an exhibition 2 years ago, a retrospective, and they came for a concert at Casa Europa, and it was so charming. They were so charming, and we were showing photographs of when they were that little. So, Leonard was not only a musician, played violin, but of course a very prolific artist. Thousands of paintings in his in the estate, which we still have. Yeah.
So after that year, you were 15. You went home. When did you come back again to San Miguel?
I came back quite frequently. I came back when I was 18, and then 19, and then perhaps a few years in between because I did some world traveling. I think that my experience in San Miguel gave me what I call the travelese. I mean, to be exposed to other cultures and other worlds really informed me as a human, to the human condition. And I think the other thing is that I got my beginnings as an artist. I became an artist because of Leonard and Reva. I mean, they gave me my opportunity to spread my wings, to explore whatever I wanted. And because of that, I became an artist, and I have been a successful clay artist my whole life. I was opened to culture and music and poetry, and of course it made a deep imprint. I think I was already ready for something like that, but it made such a deep imprint on me. I remember when the circus rolled into town, and it was like a Fellini film. That was one thing. I thought it was just very surreal. I remember other artists that were always coming to the house, and musicians. I remember there was always some cultural event going on. I remember my teachers who were Mexican, who I really cherished. They were very generous with me. People were constantly coming in, musicians, artists, writers, painters. I remember on Sunday nights, the girls at the Jardin would walk around in one direction, and the boys would walk around in the other direction. And this was a courting ritual that I was told was happening at the Plaza Central. And I thought it was so charming that you were eyeing the boys and the boys were eyeing the girls. And then if you felt like you wanted to meet somebody, you would have a chaperone, and then you might be able to sit and chat with a chaperone at that time when I was 15, or maybe if you were lucky to hold hands. That was actually a really wonderful experience. Did you ever
get in the circle?
I did get in the circle, and I walked around, but I was quite shy when I was 15. You know, of course, interested in boys then, but I do recall meeting a very handsome Mexican young man. Yeah. And again, you know, when I look back on that, it's all, you know, it's very sweet and very innocent, you know. The ambience of San Miguel in those years was truly very surreal. It was like a Fellini film, to tell you the truth. That's how it was for me. That architecture and the lights, and it was very small. So San Miguel was not anything like it is today. It was so tiny.
And the smell.
And the smells of the tortillas, the smell of the jasmine was heady. I remember at night that the night blooming jasmine would just waft over me, and I think I was born a little bit of a dreamer and an artist. So nature has always been so important to me. So when I smell that jasmine here, I get transported right back into my youth here in San Miguel. It was truly a magical time for me. Well, I met Leonard Cohen, and at that time he was in his monkish, Zen monk stage of his life. Very intriguing. We always had visitors from all over the world. We have in Reva and Leonard's archives, I can't even count how many books of guest books. She always had people write who came through. And there was famous people and musicians and artists, and there was always something going on culturally at their home. I did stay on, they were on Quebrada, then they were on Calle de la Quinta. So there was always cultural, music, art. There was always something so intriguing and stimulating for me when I was here.
What were you doing, though, when you came back?
When I came back, I was either studying something, another technique in art, or teaching. So I got to teach. I had the great opportunity to teach at the Instituto Allende. You know, the confluence of them coming here and then not having children. I think if they had had children, I would not have been so involved in their lives. Reva and my mother were sisters, yeah. So I was just embraced and taken in. The other part of it, too, is that Reva and Leonard weren't the easiest people to... Leonard was a very tense artist, and Reva had her own challenges. So as an aunt and uncle, it wasn't always easy for me, but there was something that I really just felt like that I really related to, and they would come to Toronto quite a bit and influence our lives as well in Toronto. The hippie era.
Yeah, so what was that like?
Oh, that was so exciting and so wonderful. This was the time when, it was, of course, it was still illegal for pot smoking, but everybody was into pot smoking and music, and the arts culture was so rich, and I was teaching now at the Instituto for a semester and learning new techniques and working with different clays and being exposed to all these musicians, and it was a wild time. I will say it was a wild time, yes.
And so your connection with San Miguel obviously has continued. So since then, you come back on a regular basis?
I come back on a regular basis. There was a period of time for about 10 years that I did not come. When Leonard passed away, when Leonard and Reva, Reva died in 2004, Leonard in 2011.
At the age of 100.
Leonard, the ripe old age of 100. I'll tell you something, this is interesting. Reva, my auntie, my darling auntie, kept me away from Leonard for most of my life. She said, don't bother your Uncle Leonard. He's busy doing his art, and don't bother your Uncle Leonard. So I didn't have access to Leonard until Reva died. We got to know him, actually, really, for the first time. So I really got to know Leonard in the last part of his life, and saw what he had changed a lot too. He used to be very tense and he had to be making art or playing music because he needed this outlet. It was really important for him, right? So I got to spend time with him at that time. So there was a big break, and then I spent time back at the Calle de la Quinta where he lived. Leonard, as an artist, I'm going to be honest here. As an artist, he was very driven, and his art and his music was everything. So he was quite, Reva kept him working. She took care of everything else. So at Calle de la Quinta, this is where they lived, and the property's still there, and all of his work, a lot of his work is still intact. It was a really special time for me to spend with Leonard. He had softened so much. He was still painting up until 100. We'd sit on the couch and laugh. For the first time in my life, and during the last 10 years of his life, I really got to know him. It was quite magical.
What did he like to talk about?
He liked to talk about, he did lament that he didn't realize how much my aunt had suffered. Reva really did suffer from mental health issues. That's no secret. And he would lament about that over and over again. But then when he would meet lots of young artists. He would invite lots of young artists to come, and he'd have me be his assistant. And he'd say, "Go grab that paint and that." And so I would bring everything into the sala at Calle de la Quinta, and he would laugh and he would paint. He really worked right up into his 100th. He died 2 weeks into his 100th birthday. And San Miguel calls me. Even though the changes are huge, I still feel the magic of this place.